This is our town, the place we call home.
Welcome to This Is Our Town with Jeff Yorkie, a local public affairs presentation on MonroeCountyRadio.com.
Hello again, everybody, and welcome to Our Town. This is Jeff Yorkie, and in our town today, we have Sally Sulfaro. And Sally, you are you're an original member of this community, right?
That's correct. Born and raised.
Born and raised. Now you don't live here now, though, right?
No, we moved from here in about 2000.
About 2000.
Northern Michigan. Yeah.
Now your son, however, Abe Sulfaro, your late son, Abe Sulfaro, he passed away in 2014, right?
Correct.
He also born and raised here.
Yes, he
and
was.
He lived here right up until did he live here or lived in Detroit for a while?
He actually lived here in Monroe, but he, for all intents and purposes, had become a Detroiter.
Right. And that's what we want to talk about because I want to start. Obviously, Sally, your son and you are both writers, and Abe is an art. He was an artist, right? He was more than just a writer, but he wrote a novel before he found out that he was ill, and talked to you about that in the last months of his life, and shared it with you right before he passed away, and then after he passed away, you took that and got that published, right?
Yes, we did. I think that he died thinking that may never find print.
Yeah.
But we made sure that it did, and it was published, and also a follow-up book of poems and song lyrics.
Right. Because he was a musician as well.
Musician,
in fact,
yes.
A professionally trained musician.
Yes.
Went to Boston, right?
He went to Berklee College of Music in Boston.
Right.
Yeah. He had a 4-year degree there in music productions.
Right.
Yes.
I can relate to that. My son is actually going to the Detroit Institute of Music Education to get a degree in commercial songwriting.
Oh.
He's getting ready to leave here this fall. So I can totally relate to everything that you went through. But what's really cool here about this is that you are here in town because you are going to do a trailer, right, to promote Abe's book.
Correct. Tomorrow evening at dusk, we're going to shoot a book trailer in an alley here in Monroe. I actually wanted to shoot that trailer in Detroit.
Right.
And the bureaucracy there and the liability insurance and everything got to be just too much. So I spoke with the Monroe City Council, and they were very gracious and cooperative. So we're gonna do it tomorrow right here in downtown Monroe, where Abe grew up.
Not surprised that Monroe would take care of one of their own. Two of their own, actually. But, let's talk a little bit about that book because I had the pleasure of being able to read that book. And let me just tell you something. I have to ask you. Obviously, losing a child is it's a very tragic thing. And I can only imagine that it's still difficult for you some 5 years after it happened. I can relate. My in-laws lost their son who was my age, and at about the same time in 2014. And so I've been watching them go through the exact same thing that I know you're going through. What the difference here, I think, for you and why I envy the fact that you have this is you have a legacy, a written legacy, and having read this book, I can tell you that we talked a little bit before you came on. There's these streams of consciousness that Abe, through the character that he has this sort of treatise about. He describes all what the character is thinking, but you can tell from reading the book that a lot of this is Abe. And how did that make you feel the first time you read that?
His father, let's talk about his father, who's also a Monroe native, for just a minute, read the book. I tend to be a girl who from the 60s who is pretty open-minded about a lot of things, including her children, and they're both musicians. But his father read the book and said, "Oh, no, not my son. That's not my son who wrote that book." And I had to remind him that this is fiction.
Right.
The story's fiction.
Because it's a dark book.
It is
I mean,
very dark.
there's I mean, this is like a
Yes.
Quentin Tarantino movie.
Absolutely.
Right? I mean, it's some crazy stuff in here. And
Yeah.
so I can imagine I can imagine Abe's father's reaction, because the first couple of chapters you read this book and you're going, whoa, what's the deal, man? Right?
Yeah,
I mean, it's and so that had to be the initial reaction. But it's not until you start getting into and having known him. I read the introduction and then the epilogue at the end of the book, where you kind of talk a little bit about Abe.
Yeah.
And so I felt like I kind of got to know him, and you could tell that these streams of consciousness that were going on in this very dark character throughout this book, this guy that's struggling with good and bad and evil and everything else, and demons and everything else that affect you. You can tell that he struggled with all of that stuff, but it was a healthy kind of debate that he was having in his mind.
I think rather than being a study in abnormal psych.
Oh yeah,
it's
right.
more of an inside look at the I guess machinations of this person who's torn between what is social justice and
Yeah.
how far do I take it on the streets of Detroit.
Right.
In this post-apocalyptic sort of scene where he's scraping a living off the gritty underbelly of the city at night.
Yeah.
And he has no identity.
Right.
His comrades are this close-knit group of goths or gothic guys
Right.
from the infamous Leland City Club
Yep.
in Detroit
Yep.
on Bagley Street.
Which is still around, by the way.
was.
It's not goth all the time anymore.
No,
it used to be.
You are really up on this stuff,
Well,
Jeff. That is
you know,
great.
do my research.
I'm impressed. Yes, so tomorrow when we shoot the trailer, actually, two of his goth buddies,
Yeah.
who are characters from the book,
Right.
real life anti-heroes,
Yeah.
are coming to Monroe from Detroit, and they're going to shoot this video with me in an alley 1 block over, and their names are Spam
Yep.
and Disintegration.
Yeah. Dave Disintegration, right?
Dave Disintegration. They'll be here in person. And
And that's actual characters in the book. Now,
absolutely.
hopefully they haven't done half the things that that Fade, who is your son's the author's character, right?
Mm-hmm.
Fade, Dave Disintegration, and Spam. They did some really bad things in this book,
They
right?
did,
There's
yes.
crazy things. But folks, I'm telling you, take the time. You got to read. What's the name of the book again?
The Anti-Heroes subtitle is Treatise of a Lost Soul.
Yes. And it is a fascinating commentary, really, about that subculture, that Gothic subculture of the 1990s. There was, my wife and I were talking this morning, there was a line in there, and it was sort of a perversion of the golden rule. And it was, do unto others as they would do unto you.
Yes.
And that was, right?
Yes.
And I said to my wife, I said, my God, that kind of describes that, really that generation. When you think about like the school shooters and all of that, it's this subculture out there that says, hey, you know what? You teach us, you taught us all, do unto others as you would have them do unto you, but you guys just keep screwing with us. So we're gonna, or as you would have them do, as you would do unto yourself. But they just sort of change it around,
Yeah.
and it's more of a revenge type of thing, and that's what drives Fade and his buddies in this book, right?
Yeah, well, it is, and also it's just honestly a way to make a living without holding a day job, but they do it in some dark, bloody ways at night
Yeah,
on these streets in these crack houses. So, but the deep thought, this is not light reading, and some of the deep thoughts that always come back to me are this, where it's the stream of consciousness stuff where the main character, Fade, is pondering and grappling with life and death, and is there a God? He never denies that there's a God, but he says something like, I believe that whatever life force put human beings here just put life into motion and let it roll.
Yeah.
In other words, hey guys, you're on your own.
Right.
This is God talking. You're on your own.
Right. That was sort of his philosophy about God. It was God wasn't, there was nothing like fate or anything like that. God put everybody here and said, I gave you all the tools. Now you figure out what to do with them.
Right.
And what's fascinating is that his sort of dialogue in the book and his sort of commentary is that so many times people have to, unlike animals who just do everything instinctively, right? People they can make all of these choices, and sometimes they make these choices that just make no sense to what the animal world would be. And he sort of questions who's really civilized here.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, as a matter of fact, he says in the book that he admires the great cats he talked about. They had no need for feeling guilt
Right.
or shame or anything. If they needed to eat, they killed to survive. Other than that, they were fine with everybody. Live and let live.
Right.
But if I have to survive and it's you or me, guess what?
Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
And that was where the character Fade in the book kind of lived that.
Yes, he did.
And that's what that was the dark side of this. But it was also the explanation of why Fade did those things. So back to the original question. Your husband read it, or your Abe's father.
Yes,
read it.
he is my husband.
Is he?
right?
Okay. Sorry, that was one thing I didn't do the research on.
Another kid from the streets of Monroe, by the way.
So he read it and he said, "Oh no, that is not my son. My son would never do anything like that." Now you read it, and what was your reaction?
Abe was sort of like, if your mom likes your music and if your mom likes the book, it's probably no good. He sometimes didn't give me credit.
Yeah.
I was definitely not his friend. I was his mom.
Right,
Okay?
right.
So I did get it right away and had no problem with anything I read in there. I realized this is fiction, and I was not a bit surprised about the deep thought in there.
Yeah.
Not a bit. He was a reclusive guy,
Yeah.
unless he was on a rock and roll stage.
Right.
Yeah.
Which, hey, by the way, he was not just rock and roll. He did a little country music too,
He
right?
he and his brother both could do a little everything. They could do jazz. Abe loved to croon Tony Bennett and Frank Sinatra.
And he was a singer, right?
He was a singer and also did some keys and
Yeah.
some writing. But but if he, I think his first love, they did country for years
Yeah.
to pay the rent and buy the groceries.
And had quite a following, as
Yes,
I recall.
they did. They were probably one of the largest country music people in the early 90s, or groups in the early 90s in the greater Detroit area, the James Michael
Right.
Simmons Band.
And they recorded in Nashville at some point
They
too,
did.
right?
They
Yeah.
did.
So now let's talk a little bit about what Sally's doing, because you wrote a. We were debating before we went on the air. We were debating, is it a sequel? Is it a prequel? Is it? But you're taking Anti-Heroes, Abe's book, and you are writing the next stage in that life, right?
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about that.
Okay, well, I guess I would start with what sort of triggered this idea in my mind to write this sequel to the Anti-Heroes. I'll never be the writer Abe was, but I was inspired one morning when we were sitting in a piazza in Italy, in a town called Pontremoli. And that place just sort of, I was getting ready to retire. And again, my poor Italian husband from Ford Motor Company said to me, "Are you crazy?" I was getting ready to retire, got this phone call. I was on the road working. I was a national vice president with a healthcare company at the time. And my younger son, who was also in deep grieving with me,
Sure.
all of us, called and said, "Mom, we're in Italy, my wife and I, just bombing around, and we found this stone farmhouse, and the price is right. How about if I sell everything I own and you throw in what you have and let's buy it?" And I said, "Yeah, okay." And my husband said, "Are you nuts?" It's turned out to be very good. But long story short, we're there in Italy to close on this house, which I believe just dropped into our lap. And across the piazza is this man with shoulder-length black hair standing in the sunlight, and it was Abe.
Oh yeah.
Okay. Now, I know better.
Right.
It's not Abe. It's a guy who looked like him.
Yeah.
But when you are grieving that deeply over someone you love that much, you'll grasp at anything.
Sure.
And I started thinking, what if consciousness overlaps? There's this thing called quantum entanglement. I think Einstein described it, and
Yeah.
Niels Bohr described it later. And what if our consciousnesses, which we don't understand yet, actually do interact with each other and become entangled? And could this man here have anything at all to do with my son Abe, who I lost a couple years ago? It was 2016 at the time. So I got to thinking, I'm going to write a book. And in this book, I'm going to start with the death of Fade in the Anti-Heroes in Detroit. And I'm going to jump back centuries, which I at first didn't think I was going to do that, but stuff just started to it was magic.
Uh-huh.
The stuff was just attracted to my computer and just dropped into my lap. And I discovered that where we bought this house is on an ancient route called the Via Francigena, or the Via Romea, which is the old Pilgrim's Way. So when Christianity was brand new in Europe, people from all over Europe would make this pilgrimage to Rome, and some of them would go on to Jerusalem. Do you know that runs through our property?
No kidding.
And our house in Italy sits on property that used to be owned. It used to be owned by the church next door, which is called the Chapel of the Pilgrims, Cappella dei Pellegrini. So I thought, okay, what went on here at this house and this church next door? Come to find out, the Archbishop of Canterbury in the year 990 stopped there because they were trying to avoid the tolls in the bigger cities. So they would go off path a little bit through farmlands or wherever they had to go, and that's how that chapel got there.
Wow.
So I developed this character who became the precursor, that's probably the wrong word, to Fade.
Fade, right.
To Fade, and his name is Maffeo or Feo, who was the navigator for Sigeric, the Archbishop of Canterbury, and stopped at our stone farmhouse in the year 990. And all of the entanglements of him and the people around him and their journey, and he finally gets killed in Rome.
You're giving away the end, Sally.
Okay, I'm sorry. He does get killed in Rome, guys. He does. But at the very end, it brings us back to the current time and a girlfriend who we thought was, now I am giving it away.
Don't give it away. Don't give it away. Don't give away too much.
Okay.
Let me ask you a couple of
Okay.
questions.
All right.
Seriously, because the book right now is being published, right?
Well, The Anti-Heroes is published, but Co-Eternals, which is the sequel I've written, is being printed.
Being printed. That's
Yeah,
what I meant.
yeah.
So let me ask you this. 'Cause from the minute that I heard that you were doing this, I was curious about this. Do you follow the same sort of recipe that Abe did? Is there going to be a stream of consciousness that maybe is a little bit of Sally Sulfaro?
Well, yes, and I tried to do that. And
Yeah.
so people's characters, their thoughts, their stream of consciousness, what they're thinking is in italics in the book, so you'll
Yeah.
know it's their thoughts.
Right.
Is it as deep or provocative as what Abe wrote? No.
Well, you don't want to think that, but we'll see.
I don't think so.
I'll be the
but-
judge of that,
okay,
Sally.
let me know. Please let me know. Yeah.
But I'm curious because that was what really made this Abe's book really fascinating. And like I said, it got me to the point where I've never met Abe, but it felt like I knew him. Between what you wrote in the beginning and the end of the book, what a little bit that I knew about him, and reading that book, I felt like I got to know him. And I think it would be very fascinating to get that same sort of idea via the character that you have in your book, to get Sally Sulfaro, Mom, to get Mom's sort of stream of consciousness and get to know Mom from this whole thing. So that might be kind of fascinating in an interesting way of going about this when you're reading that book.
I'll look forward to getting your feedback on
For sure.
what
I
you
can't
say
wait.
about it.
Well, I can't wait. I really can't. And when it gets out and after I've read it, you have to come back on. We can talk about it
I
again.
will.
Sound good?
And all of these books, including Abe's volume of song lyrics and poems and quotes, will all be at the Book Nook here in Monroe.
Right here at the Book Nook.
The Book Nook in Monroe.
All right. So once again, Abe Sulfaro, Anti-Heroes. And what's the name of the other book? I forget the
second book of his is
Right.
called Memoirs des Nocturnes, an anthology.
Yes. And your book is entitled
My book is called Co-Eternals, a
Co-Eternal.
story of entangled consciousness.
Perfect. I am so looking forward to reading that. I can tell you this: I could not put Abe's book down. It was absolutely fascinating. And I mean, the underlying story is really cool. It's a little dark, but what really ties everything together is that stream of consciousness. It was really fascinating. And thank you so much for sharing that with the rest of us.
Oh, well, thank you for having me.
And I can't wait to see the trailer that you guys do. Should be pretty cool.
Oh, thank you so much, Jeff.
Well, Sally, I want to thank you for being on the show. That's all the time we have.
Okay.
But you come back again, and we'll talk more about your book, okay?
Okay. Thank you so much.
All right. That is all the time we have for this edition of This Is Our Town. I want to thank everybody for listening, and we'll see you next week. Take care, everybody.
Join us every Sunday at noon and Tuesday at 7 p.m. for another edition of This Is Our Town with Jeff Yorkie, a local public affairs presentation of MonroeCountyRadio.com.
This is our town, the place we call home.